So for this problem, we're making soccer balls and we're making volleyballs. And we want to know how many balls of each we should use to make a maximum profit, and then what that maximum profit is. Now, in some problems, they tell you what variables to use and what they should represent, but they're not telling us that for this problem. Typically, you want your variables to represent what you're looking for. In this case, we're looking for how many soccer balls and how many volleyballs. And once we know that, then we could answer the second question of the profit. So I'm going to choose to use S and V, the number of volleyballs and the number of soccer balls. Now, some of you may not want to use S because your S's look too much like 5s. But so that my variables tie into what they're representing, I'm choosing to use S and V. Now, for two of our inequalities, we're going to have V greater than or equal to 0 because we can't have a negative number of volleyballs. And then similarly for S. S has to be greater than or equal to 0. Now, the rest of your inequalities come from your limitations. So now you want to think about what are the limitations. Well, I have only so much time for cutting, which is 500 hours, and I have so much time for sewing, which is 450 hours. Those are my limitations. So these two here are going to help me with my limitations to get my other inequalities. So since there's a maximum of 500 hours for cutting, I'm going to have some hours I use to cut volleyballs, some hours I use to cut soccer balls. Those two added together has to be less than or equal to 500 because 500 is the maximum. Similarly for sewing, I'm going to use some for sewing the volleyballs and some for sewing the soccer balls, and that has to be less than or equal to 450 because that's the maximum we have available. So when we're dealing with trying to figure out the cutting hours, I'm going to be dealing with the bolded blue up here because that's dealing with cutting. When I'm trying to figure out the sewing, that's in red, and that's the bolded red, I'll be dealing with that. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at this side note to help us figure out what's going on. Suppose we had 300 soccer balls. How many hours does it take to make 300 soccer balls? So if you think of this, it'd be 4 hours to do 150, so 300 times by doubling that. So in other words, it would be 8 hours. So that's one way to think about it. However, you want to think, what is it we're doing to the 300 soccer balls that we started out with, and then to the 2 and the 75 up here for the soccer balls? What are we doing with those three numbers to get our answer? So what are we doing to the 300, the 2, and the 75 so that we get our answer of 8? Now, in this case, you could think of it as 300 divided by the 75 and then timesing it by 2. Or some of you may think of it as um, doubling or timesing by 2 and then dividing by 75. Doesn't really make a difference. They're both going to give you the same answer of 8. So what does the 300 represent? And well, that represents the number of soccer balls. So it's really the number of soccer balls divided by 75 times 2, or number of soccer balls times 2 divided by 75. Now, remember, if we're writing this out in terms of equations or an expression, the number of soccer balls was S. We're timesing it by 2, and we're dividing by 75. So that's what we'll write. We want to do some similar type of thinking when we're dealing with volleyballs. And in this case, we'll look at volleyballs and cutting. So let's take a look at doing 300 volleyballs. And in that case, that's 12 hours. So you need to think, what are we doing to the 300 from our 300 volleyballs to the 3 hours for sewing? Oh, I think I got a mistake here, so just a second. Okay, I fixed it. Instead of dealing with volleyballs like I initially had, we're going to be dealing with soccer balls. So you want to think about sewing your soccer balls. So that's 3 hours to do 75 soccer balls. So you want to think, what are you doing to the 300, the 3, and that's 75 to get that answer. So in this case, we're taking our 300 and we're dividing it by 75, and then we're multiplying it by 3. Or you can think of it as 300 times 3 and then dividing by 75. They both work. They both give you the same answer. So once again, what does the 300, oh, it's 3,000 I got. It's supposed to be 300. Sorry about that. Represent. And in this case, that would be S for the number of balls. And so in general, it's the number of balls times 3 divided by 75. So if you wanted, you could write it out like this. So number of balls, which is S for soccer, times the 3 divided by the 75. So if we look at that on the next slide here, for cutting, it's the number of balls times 2 divided by 75. For cutting of soccer balls, it's going to follow that same pattern of soccer times 3 divided by 60. Sewing is going to follow that same pattern, number of balls times 3 divided by 75. And then for soccer, for sewing, it's going to be soccer balls times 2 divided by 60. Now, in this case, some of these fractions do simplify down. This first fraction here does not, but I'm going to write that as 2 times v divided by 75. Now, this second fraction here does simplify down to a 1 over 20. So then it ends up being s over 20, and that's going to be less than our 500. This one here, the 3 over 75, simplifies down to a 1 over 25. So it's just v divided by 25 plus this 2 over 60 is 1 over 30 times s. So now these are the inequalities that we're going to be dealing with that we get from simplifying these numbers up here. So at this point, all we have to do is go ahead and graph these, and we got to find out our profit. Our profit is up here in bold, and it says our profit is $5 for each soccer ball and $4 for each volleyball. So I'm going to go 4 times the volleyballs plus 5 times the s. Now notice I had my inequalities with v's followed by s's, v's followed by s's. So I chose to write my profit in that same order. Profit from volleyballs plus profit from soccer balls. We now have to graph this and find our corner points and plug our corner points into our profit. Now, v greater than or equal to 0, s greater than or equal to 0 just puts us into the first quadrant. So all we have to do then is make a t-chart for the blue and the red. So we take 0, plug it in for our v, and it knocks this fraction out. We'd have s divided by 20 equals this. So to multiply both sides by 20, and we get 10,000. Now we want to do it the other way. Plug in 0 for our s, knocks this fraction out, and we got to then get v by itself. So multiply by 75, divide by 2, and we get 18,750. For the red, we'll do the same thing. Plug in 0 for v, knocks this fraction out, so we get s by itself. You multiply by 30, and we get 13,500. Then we'll do it the other way. Take 0, plug it in for s, knocks this fraction out. Then we go ahead and we can solve it for v by multiplying both sides by 25, and we get 11,250. So all we have to do at this point is to plot those points. So for our blue, notice I have v being first, s being second. So v is going to be on my x-axis, s is going to be on my y-axis. I go over 0, up 10,000. And then here on this one, I go right 18,750 and up 0. So all I'm going to do is plot those points, and I'm going to mark them on my axes and draw in my line. And I'm going to make it blue. We're dealing with less than. So that means we'll be shading down here in this triangle. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the red ones. I got to go over 0, up 13,500. So that's going to be up here. Then I got to go over 11,000. So that's going to be over here about. I'll mark those points. And then I need to draw in my line in between those red points. I was afraid it was going to do that, so just a second. And because it's less than, I'll be shading down below. So that means all my shading is really in this area right in here. So I need to find my corner points. Well, it's pretty easy to find this corner point. That's 0, 0. This point here is 11,250 over and up 0, so that's easy to find because that's in our table. This point right here in blue is over 0, up 10,000, so that was easy to find. So 0, 10,000. And then we had 11,250, comma 0. So now all we have to do is find this point here, the purple point. Well, that purple point is really just the two lines, the red and the blue, so all we have to do is solve this system of equations. I would personally use matrices. It would be pretty easy. Then I wanted to stick these green points, 0, 0, 11,250, comma 0, and 0, comma 10,000, plus the purple point I would get from solving this equation into my profit to see which one gives me my maximum, and I can answer my question. And hey, we're done.